Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you also to the BAA for having me here today in Glasgow. Welcome to the very last session before lunch. So I apologise for the fact that I am all that's keeping you from the lovely food that would be outside. So I'll try not to drag this out too much today. However, I'll point out as well, obviously I'm a psychologist, not an audiologist. I do wear hearing aids, so it may be a problem when it comes down to questions a bit later. And also, I do have tinnitus myself. And I think it's my own personal experiences with tinnitus that effectively got me into the role that I have today. And I'm particularly fascinated by the fact that tinnitus is so personal, so subjective, and everybody views it in a very different way. So it allows us to actually get all psychological with it. Now, I don't need to spend too much time today, obviously, with the audience that we have here in order to talk about tinnitus itself, but it's going to be more about how people cope with tinnitus, how people recognize that it may actually be a threat, about how it might be something, to oppose them and their well-being, and something that can cause distress and make them feel quite ill. Now, again, what I find is so interesting is the concept of the ambiguous situation, and about how different people with different personalities will actually view exactly the same event in different ways. So I'd like to take the opportunity to try to picture a scene where maybe the next time you're at a meeting, you're at work, and you're all sat around the table having a committee meeting, or however it works out at your place of work. And somebody comes up with an idea. And the most striking thing about this idea is that it is a terrible idea. It's a waste of resources, it's unethical, it's too expensive. Any reason you can think of, it's a disaster. So reluctant as you are, you have to stand up and say, this isn't going to work. This is probably going to be a total mistake. Everybody takes your side. The meeting finishes, and a bit later, thinking not too much of it, you're actually back at work, at your computer, laptop, wherever else it might be. The person whose idea it was comes sauntering over to you and your laptop with a big hot steaming cup of coffee, trips, and their coffee goes splash all over your laptop, everywhere. And they go, oh, sorry. So the idea about it is that you literally have two ways that you could interpret this situation. You can either A, think benefit of the doubt, just a terrible accident, or B, you could think to yourself, this person is trying to get back at me because of the meeting before. So that one instant, we split into two different categories of response. So you have to think, when you spool this kind of thing back to the idea of waking up in the middle of the night to hear tinnitus for the first time and thinking, what is this noise? To an extent, it also depends on what's going on with that person at the time. Are they having a problem in their marriage? Do they live alone? Have they just come back from a great night out? Whatever else it will be, then it's going to be personality, it's going to be situation, judgment, and context that allow them to view that tinnitus, and whether they think of it as, oh, that's annoying, and then they turn over and go back to sleep, or they sit bolt upright in bed thinking, what's wrong? My hearing going? Do I have a brain tumour? Will I get to sleep again? And spooling off onto something of great concern, because always it's down to the brain orientating towards threat. And if you feel distressed about something, you start paying attention to it, it gets more noticeable, it gets louder, you're worried about it, and people get trapped in this loop. Can also fit in terms of game with the idea of context. So when I go around self-help groups in the north of England and I do some talking, I always show this glass of water, because on some basic level, in terms of personality, you are either going to be a glass half full, half glass empty kind of person, but it will still vary regarding to the context of when you see that glass of water. So say you wake up again in the middle of the night and you're thirsty, dying of thirst, and by your bedside is half a glass of water. You'll think, yes, grab it, glug it down, thinking, thank goodness for that. But if you're having a lovely romantic dinner at an expensive restaurant and you don't particularly want to spend £10.50 on a bottle of sparkling water, so you ask the waiter to bring you over a glass of tap water instead, and they stomp over looking miserable, dump half a glass of tepid water on the table and charge you £1 for the privilege, that glass of water will not be seen in anywhere near as positive a light. So you find what's going on around you, negative events, etc., can alter your perception of something that is going on. And that's the kind of thing I want to get to today. So, again, when you think about tinnitus and how people perceive it, not so much the sensation in terms of loudness or pitch, but the personality of the person experiencing it, then there are a couple of things I'd like to go through today. I'd like to talk briefly about extroversion, as in, what is people who are more affected by what is going on outside them compared to introverts. A bit about neuroticism, again to prove the point about how personalities matter in perception of tinnitus, and then to spend a bit more time on locus of control, which may be a little bit more obscure. Now, the thing about neuroticism is that as much as I try to balance things out, it can become quite difficult to find something positive to say about it when an individual scores quite highly on a questionnaire measuring neuroticism, because it's about tendency towards strong negative emotions. Neuroticism questionnaire, I get irritated easily, do you agree with this statement, do you have frequent mood swings? But generally, if someone is actually measured as being high in neuroticism, then it's someone who actually becomes stressed at a lesser event. So it's the idea when you have a hurdle to actually climb over in order to become stressed, for someone who is high in neuroticism, that hurdle is lower. They perceive more things around them as being stressful. Now, it's also noticed that those scoring highly in neuroticism are those more likely to report tinnitus. That doesn't necessarily mean they may be more likely to have it, but they are more likely to present in a worried state about it. So you actually find, again, the one positive example I found is the concept of the healthy neuroticist. When you have someone who gets to the point of fearing death, that they eat well, they exercise well. If they spot something strange, a lump, they're more likely to go to the doctor very early indeed, and they actually have a good cancer prognosis because they tend to spot things, worry about it, and they get straight in there. So chances are, if someone had tinnitus and they actually presented an audiology clinic, it may very well be that they may score more highly in neuroticism to worry about it in the first place. So it is something that could actually affect the sort of person who selects themselves to come to see you. Now, the other one I want to talk about before locus of control, just again to prove the point about how it can change appraisal, is not so much extroversion, but the idea of introversion, which is not someone who is shy, but is someone who ends up getting quite drained by having been consistently social in large crowds. So they can get out there, they can chat, have a nice time, but then they've got to have a rest because they actually find it's all quite tiring and they're the sense that they need to recharge by themselves. Now, it actually is great interest to me that people who are defined as introvert actually have a denser prefrontal cortex behind the forehead. And this is a part of the brain that actually responds to attention. So on a basic level, people who are more introverted are more attentive and they actually perceive more about the same event. So they have greater powers of attention, and extroverts are more likely to be distracted. They're more likely to see a shiny thing over there, or a noise, or what have you, and actually pay attention to that. So they are more about, well, introverts tend to try to focus on the same thing, but they will actually find it can sometimes be quite difficult to do so when there's a lot going on, because they have to try to concentrate on something they dislike, thing that will actually take them away from what they're focusing on. Now, what you actually find is that because introverts seemingly wanting to pay so much attention to a specific thing, you can actually find that if you start throwing stimuli at them, you get much stronger responses. So what I find fascinating about this, again, whenever you have psychologists electrocuting people, it's always the example I tend to bring out, but I really don't do this sort of stuff. But you find if you take someone who is more introverted, and you actually present them with an electric shock, they will describe it as being more painful. If you actually ask them to drink a few drops of lemon juice, you find that someone who is introverted produces 10 times the saliva of somebody who is extroverted. So that event, that thing that they're facing, is much more powerful than it is for other people. So introverts will always report a greater intensity or a scenario or a stimulation. So we start to think, how could this affect their perception of their own tinnitus, and how they have a larger area of the brain devoted to attention that will latch onto that sensation, and for them, they will perceive their tinnitus as being louder and quite possibly more distressing. Now, going on from that and the idea of how personality can change how you perceive things is going on to the other topic for today of locus of control. Now, our locus of control is literally a spectrum. You can either be at one end of it or at the other end of it. Most of it tend to be somewhere in the middle. But we refer to somebody either having an internal locus of control, to have an external locus of control, or again, more likely that most of it are blundering around in the middle, depending on time of day and situation and the like. But there are still a number of people at each end, and it's worth defining these people. So, if you have an internal locus of control, you are someone who actually takes responsibility for the things going on around you. Things happen because you make decisions, you make choices, and you make them happen. So it's about the idea that you act and impose your will onto the world. Now, if you are the opposite, when you have an external locus of control, then you actually believe that stuff happens to you, and you have to try to cope with all the slings and arrows that comes at you with destiny and everything else. So, a good example, again, because I lecture, is if I've got 200 students sitting my exam in biological psychology in the first year, and a few people, unfortunately, will fail it, then if I ask them to come in, and I talk to them about, what happened, where did it go wrong? People with a more internal locus of control will take responsibility for that event, and will say something along the lines of, yeah, I should have done some work. But, I didn't. Next time I'll work, next time I will revise, I will do more. But people with a more external locus of control will tend to say something on the lines of, it's not fair, James is mean, that exam was nothing like the other exam, I couldn't possibly have done well, it's just wrong. So you find these are the people who don't tend to adapt and don't tend to adjust to the situation and don't tend to take personal responsibility for improving their actions. Now, there are times when each of these personality types is actually rather advantageous. So you find, if you think about hearts and heart attacks, then you find people who think they have control over situations are those more likely to have heart attacks. They're more likely to become depressed, and they're more likely to perceive stress around them. So partly that you're putting a lot of pressure on yourself. Partly that no matter how forceful and robust you are, chances are a lot of things going on around you are actually not under your control. Because technically you're in charge of your thoughts, you're in charge of your behavior, and you may be able to influence somebody else's, but other people kind of do what they want. But if something goes wrong and you perceive that you are in control of that, you will blame yourself. You will feel quite depressed and down and feel a failure about something that was never your fault. So it tends to push some people toward pressure on the heart as they go through their life. Now, if you have an external locus of control, it is linked far more strongly with tinnitus distress. So if you are someone who perceived that tinnitus just came knocking one day, hopped in through the window during the night, and just basically got itself stuck inside your head, then you are someone who is far more vulnerable to suffering from distress because of it. So it creates a sense of hopelessness, a sense of, I cannot do anything about this tinnitus. There is no point going for interventions or treatments or seeing an audiologist or going to the doctor because it's just not going to change anything. It's happened and this is my life from now on. So the way that it actually is so effective, or rather so ineffective, is the fact that if you don't believe you can control the condition, then you don't attempt any effective coping strategy. So if you do, then it's half-hearted with no real desire to actually, because you do not believe there's any particular benefit from it. And I know when, again, because I do go around speaking at tinnitus groups at the north of England, I do ask people to participate in my research. And one particular individual really comes strongly to mind, because I was talking about how it's possible to habituate more to tinnitus, how over the years I have habituated to my tinnitus. And while it's still here, especially now I'm stood up here talking to you now, talking about tinnitus every other word, I'm actually quite aware of it, but I don't particularly find it to be that distressing. So I was saying you can cope. It doesn't become as bad. It doesn't have that much of an effect on your life. You can improve things. And this individual was going, what you mean? It doesn't go? I went, no, it doesn't go. But it just gets better. Yes. But it's still there. Yes. I don't want that. I don't want it to be better. I want it to go. I'm not doing anything that will actually leave it there. I want you to get rid of it. So there really is a sense where you're thinking it's about, to my mind, logically, trying to improve the condition to make yourself happier is a natural thing to do. But if you perceive the world in a different way, and you do not feel you can enact anything to actually improve that situation, then you are reluctant to engage. And you are reluctant to actually do anything to get yourself out of this situation and feeling better. So I'm interested in the idea of trying to intervene in order to boost the concept of locus of control, or specifically to take people with an external locus and push them further toward being a more internal locus of control. Because generally, choices exist, and you have the ability to make choices throughout your life and throughout your day here today. Do I have tea? Do I have coffee? It's a choice. You actually find some quite low-level interventions have some surprisingly significant effects. If you drive to the supermarket and you always park in more or less the same space, I challenge you next time to park somewhere else, to literally choose as an individual to park over there instead, to spend the next couple of days drinking tea with the offhand because you can and you choose to do so. It sounds daft, but there's a lot of studies about residential care and about how if you allow people to make small choices to influence their life, there are significant improvements in well-being. This one, I like this one because it's more student-related, and in fact the people who published this study actually describe their own results as being unbelievable. But if you actually take one of the little hand grip things, when you just squeeze them, so it comes to the point you can maintain pressure after it starts to become painful. So the idea is they took Swiss students, and all you had to do was hold the hand grip tightly as you could, for as long as you could, twice a day, and put it down in the diary for a fortnight. And most people did it. Most people can keep it tight for about a minute. It will start hurting fairly early on in that. And they had people do it. 6 months later, the group who did that twice a day performed significantly better in their final university exams. much better, a whole 10 percentage points, a whole grade. Now again, they were described as unbelievable by the researchers themselves. It's about the idea, finding time in your day to do this, increasing your ability to plan and organize and to take control over tiny things. As it magnifies out across a year, then you actually see surprising, almost ridiculous benefits from low-level interventions. If anybody would like to talk to me about this stuff at lunch or later before we disappear today, about the idea of really low-level stuff that can have an effect, I would be very interested in talking to you. Otherwise, I'd just like to conclude briefly that tinnitus is moderated by personality. If you are, unfortunately, well actually no, if you are an extrovert with low levels of neuroticism and a strong internal locus of control, the tendency to cope with tinnitus will actually be quite high. But if you have these other personalities that I stress in other situations can be very advantageous, you are nevertheless more vulnerable to tinnitus. So thank you very much for listening.